Demerara, 1823. On a night heavy with the scent of burning cane, 9,000 African Americans rose together. At their head stood Jack Gladstone, turning fury into flame. A rebellion that made the mighty British Empire tremble. In the early 19th century, Demerara, what we know today as Guyana, was not just a tropical colony, it was a factory of human suffering. Vast plantations stretched as far as the eye could see, oceans of sugarcane swaying in the humid wind. These fields did not grow sweetness. They grew wealth for Britain, wealth paid for in the sweat, blood, and bones of enslaved African Americans. Every day, thousands were driven under the Sunday. Men and women hacked at cane stalks with machetes until their arms shook. Children carried bundles nearly heavier than their bodies. Nights were no refuge. Fires roared in the boiling houses, where sugar was turned into crystals and molasses, while the enslaved were whipped to keep them awake. The colony was a pressure cooker of violence. Overseers carried whips like extensions of their arms, lashing without hesitation. Planters enforced rules that stripped away dignity: no marriage without permission, no gatherings without surveillance, no rest without suspicion. Religion was tolerated only so long as it did not inspire hope. And yet, hope crept in. Among these thousands was Jack Gladstone. His back, like many others, bore the scars of punishment, but his eyes held something dangerous: the ability to dream. Jack was the son of Guyana, a respected elder in the church and a man of quiet but unbreakable faith. While others bowed their heads in silence, father and son listened carefully to sermons about freedom, equality before God, and rumors drifting across the Atlantic that in Britain, voices were rising against slavery. To the British planters, Jack was a worker, a body to be broken and replaced. But to those who labored beside him, he became something else: a listener, a thinker, a man who whispered of a life beyond the cane fields. The darkness in Demerara was more than physical. It was the weight of centuries, pressing down on every back bent over cane. But in that same darkness, sparks were forming. Jack Gladstone was about to transform whispers into a fire the empire could not ignore. Jack Gladstone was not only an enslaved laborer, he was a craftsman, a carpenter by trade. He knew how to shape wood, how to carve order from raw material. It was a skill that gave him a different kind of respect among the enslaved community. A carpenter could build, repair, create, and Jack carried that same instinct into the world of ideas. He believed freedom could be crafted too. The church was his school. British missionaries preached about salvation and dignity, sometimes cautiously, for fear of offending planters. But Jack and Guyana heard more than words of faith. They heard a code, a promise that before God no man had the right to own another. When Jack left the pews and returned to the cane fields, those words burned hotter than the tropical Sunday. News filtered in from England. There were debates in Parliament, pamphlets circulated by abolitionists, whispers that slavery's days were numbered. But for Jack, waiting for distant lawmakers was not enough. He watched friends collapse in exhaustion, women cry from brutal treatment, men whipped until their skin peeled. He asked himself the question that would define his life: if the law will not free us, must we not free ourselves? To dream of freedom was not unusual. To speak it aloud was. Jack's voice, calm but resolute, began to gather followers. He spoke of a plan not of random vengeance, but of coordinated action. A rebellion not built on slaughter, but on seizing the plantations, disarming the masters, and forcing the British to listen. Guyana, older and more cautious, worried about the blood that might follow, but he trusted his son's conviction. Together, they sowed the seeds of organization. Cane cutters, house servants, field hands, they all listened in hushed gatherings, hearts pounding with the possibility that life could change. Jack's dream was not madness, it was clarity. He saw the truth. No whip could erase the yearning for dignity. No sugar profit could outweigh the human soul. And as he crafted this vision with the care of a carpenter shaping timber, the colony inched closer to the day when thought would become action. By 1823, the cane fields of Demerara carried more than the sound of machetes slicing stalks. Beneath the rhythm of labor, another pulse beat whispers of change, quiet but unstoppable. Jack Gladstone and his father Guyana became the center of this undercurrent. Meetings were never held openly. They took place in the shadows of huts, in corners of the sugar-boiling houses after midnight, in the pauses between the overseers' patrols. The enslaved spoke in fragments, code phrases, and nods, Even the walls seemed to listen. For if a single word reached the ears of the planters, the whip and the noose would follow. But fear was not enough to silence Jack. His plan was as bold as it was disciplined. This would not be a revolt of blind fury, burning everything in sight. It would be a rebellion with a purpose. Seize the plantations, lock away the masters, strip them of their weapons, and hold the colony until Britain itself was forced to confront their demand. The difference was crucial. Jack understood that if blood flowed too freely, it would justify merciless retaliation. Instead, he envisioned something more radical, an uprising that proved the enslaved were not beasts, but men with order, intelligence, and vision. Kwamina's presence was equally vital. Where Jack's words carried fire, Kwamina's faith carried calm. He assured others that God himself was on the side of the oppressed. His quiet strength gave legitimacy to the cause, persuading even the most hesitant to trust. One by one, the enslaved leaned in. Field hands, house servants, skilled workers, all found a place in the plan. The numbers swelled, not from coercion, but from conviction. What began as whispers grew into a chorus. Freedom was no longer a dream, it was a task. The spark caught. The question was no longer if they would rise, but when. The sugar fields of Demerara, so often a site of suffering, now became the breeding ground for revolution. The day arrived, cloaked in ordinary routine. The sun rose over the cane fields as it always did, golden light spilling across acres of green. Overseers barked orders. The enslaved bent their backs to work. Nothing suggested that history was about to crack open. Then the signal came. Accounts differ. Some say it was a drumbeat, others a horn, still others a word passed mouth to mouth. Whatever it was, it spread like fire across dry cane. In moments, order dissolved. From huts and fields, thousands surged forward. They carried machetes, cutlasses, clubs, even sharpened sticks, whatever their hands could hold. To the planters, it must have seemed like the earth itself had risen. Nearly 9,000 African Americans were in motion, united by the dream of freedom. Plantations fell one by one. Overseers were disarmed, some captured alive, others fleeing in panic. Masters who had never imagined themselves powerless suddenly cowered. In some places, the uprising was almost bloodless. Guns taken, doors locked, authority flipped on its head. Jack Gladstone was in the thick of it. Eyewitnesses remembered his voice carrying over the chaos, urging order, demanding discipline. He called for restraint. We are not animals, we are men. We were born free. His words steadied the mass, reminding them that the goal was not senseless slaughter, but freedom itself. For hours, the colony bent under the weight of this rising tide. Dozens of plantations, symbols of British control, crumbled like brittle cane. The enslaved, who had once been voiceless, now roared as one body. And yet, beneath the triumph, shadows stirred. Planters escaped to raise alarms. Messengers rode hard to the colonial capital. The British army would not wait long to answer. But in that moment, on that day, the enslaved of Demerara stood taller than they ever had. The August sun blazed down, and for a fleeting time, they walked in its light as free men and women. What happened in Demerara that August was unlike anything the Caribbean had ever seen. Revolts had flared before sudden bursts of violence, crushed quickly, remembered in silence. But this was different. Nearly 9,000 African Americans rose together, coordinated, disciplined, vast as a human tide. From plantation to plantation, the movement grew. Fires lit the horizon, not as wanton destruction, but as signals, beacons that told the oppressed, we are no longer alone. Men who had once been broken by labor now carried themselves upright, cutlasses flashing in their hands. Women, too, stepped forward, their voices part of the chorus demanding freedom. Jack Gladstone was their anchor. Where fear threatened to break them, his voice steadied. He reminded them this was not a war of vengeance, but a war of dignity. We are not beasts of burden, he proclaimed, standing tall in the midst of thousands. We were born to be free, and today we prove it. The power of his words rippled outward. Entire estates collapsed without resistance. Overseers dropped their weapons, surrounded by the sheer force of numbers. Plantation masters who had once thought themselves gods over life and death now tasted fear. Their authority turned to dust. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed the impossible had arrived. The cane fields no longer rang with the crack of whips, but with the roar of liberation. Songs rose, footsteps thundered, Hearts beat in unison. 9,000 voices became a single defiant declaration. The enslaved would not remain enslaved. But freedom was fragile. Even as plantations fell, the rebellion faced a ticking clock. The British Empire, vast and merciless, was already stirring. Soldiers marched, muskets loaded, horses saddled, cannons rolled into position. The tide that had risen so high was about to meet the iron wall of empire. The planters wasted no time. Panic spread across Demerara, and with it, desperate calls for military aid. By nightfall, the colony's rulers had already summoned troops. The British response was swift and uncompromising. Red-coated soldiers advanced with grim efficiency. Cavalry units thundered down the plantation roads, sabers drawn, their horses snorting in the heat. Cannons were dragged into position, mouths yawning toward the fields where thousands had gathered. This was not negotiation, it was annihilation in preparation. When the clash came, it was merciless. Muskets fired in volleys, smoke choking the air. Cannonballs tore into crowds, cutting down men and women alike. The cutlasses and clubs of the rebels were no match for disciplined lines of soldiers and the cold precision of European artillery. What had been an uprising of hope became a battlefield of slaughter. Still, Jack Gladstone urged his people on. He tried to hold formations, to keep the rebellion alive, but the imbalance was crushing. Hundreds fell within hours. Cries of defiance mixed with screams of pain, the sugar fields turning red with blood. Guyana, his father, vanished into the chaos. For days, he eluded capture, hunted like an animal across the colony. His steadfast faith could not shield him forever. When he was finally cornered, he met his end not with fear, but with the calm dignity of a man who knew his cause was just. The rebellion fractured under the assault. Survivors scattered into the forests and swamps, some hiding for weeks, others betrayed or starved into surrender. The great tide of 9,000 was forced back, broken against the Empire's guns. But the British victory was not clean. Though they had crushed the uprising, they could not erase what had happened. They had faced not isolated rebels, but an army of the enslaved demanding freedom. And the echo of that defiance would prove harder to silence than any battlefield cry. The sugarcane fields, once green waves swaying in the tropical breeze, turned into graveyards. Where stalks had stood tall, bodies now lay twisted. The rebellion that had surged with the strength of thousands collapsed under the iron weight of empire. The first day alone left hundreds dead. Muskets cracked, sabers flashed, and the sound of cannon fire rolled across the colony like thunder. The enslaved, armed with nothing but cutlasses and clubs, fought bravely, but bravery could not pierce iron and gunpowder. Jack Gladstone survived the first onslaught, retreating with groups of fighters into the dense forests. But the British were relentless. Patrols scoured the land, their dogs trained to track human scent, their soldiers merciless in their pursuit. Captured rebels were executed on the spot or dragged away in chains. Guyana, Jack's father, became a symbol even in his final days. Hunted like prey, he evaded capture for weeks, relying on the wilderness to hide him. But his fate was sealed. Surrounded at last, he resisted until he could resist no longer. His body was displayed as a warning, an elder who had dared to dream of freedom, now reduced to a message of terror. For Jack, the loss was devastating. His father had been the quiet strength behind the cause, the balance to his own fiery resolve. Now Jack carried both grief and guilt, a heavy burden as he tried to keep the rebellion alive. But the fields told the truth. The rebellion had been drowned in blood. The once fertile soil drank deep of sacrifice, and the air stank of smoke and decay. The Empire had won the battle. And yet, something lingered. Every drop of blood shed on the cane fields carried a voice. The cries of the dead whispered to the living, "Freedom is worth even this price." The rebellion had been crushed, but its spirit had not been silenced. Captured at last, Jack Gladstone was dragged from the wilderness into the iron grip of British law. Shackled and bruised, he was brought to trial not as a man, but as a warning. The court was staged for spectacle. Planters filled the benches, eager to see vengeance delivered. Soldiers stood guard, their muskets gleaming in the sunday. The charges were clear: inciting rebellion, disturbing the peace of the colony, threatening the authority of the crown. The outcome was never in doubt. This was not justice, it was theater, designed to remind every enslaved person that resistance meant death. And yet, when Jack stood before the judges, he did not bow, he did not beg for mercy. Instead, he lifted his head, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "We did not rise for blood," he declared. "We rose for freedom. We wanted what God gave every man the right to live as men, not beasts." His words cut sharper than any sword. Some whispered uneasily, others hardened their hearts. The planters called him a traitor, a criminal. But to those who had marched with him, who had felt the taste of freedom for even a fleeting moment, he remained a leader. The trial dragged on, filled with testimonies from planters who painted the rebels as savages, beasts unworthy of compassion. But Jack's calm defiance unsettled them. He refused to be broken. In the end, the sentence was inevitable. Dozens of rebels were condemned to death, their bodies destined for gallows and firing squads. Jack himself escaped the noose, but was marked forever by the Empire's judgment, a living reminder of what awaited those who dared to defy. Yet history would remember him differently, not as a convict in chains, but as a man who stood unflinching before the Empire, demanding freedom with nothing but his voice. In that courtroom, Jack Gladstone turned his trial into testimony, and his testimony into legacy. When the guns fell silent and the gallows emptied, the rebellion of Demerara seemed, on the surface, defeated. More than 200 had been executed, hundreds more lay dead in the fields, and the plantations returned to their routine of whips and fire. The planters congratulated themselves, believing they had restored order, but they were wrong. What had happened in Demerara in 1823 could not be erased. The sheer scale of the uprising, 9,000 African Americans rising as one, shook the very foundations of the British Empire. It was no longer possible to dismiss resistance as isolated or insignificant. The enslaved had shown they were capable of organization, of vision, of demanding freedom, not with petitions but with their bodies. Word of the rebellion traveled swiftly across the Atlantic. In London, abolitionists seized on it as proof of slavery's moral bankruptcy. Pamphlets and speeches pointed to Demerara as a colony drenched in blood because men were denied their basic humanity. Even in Parliament, the echoes of Demerara were felt. The planters called it treason. The abolitionists called it justice delayed. Jack Gladstone, though silenced in chains, became a symbol. To his enemies, he was a dangerous agitator. To his people, he was proof that courage could rise from the cane fields. His father, Kwamina, was remembered as a martyr, his death sanctified by faith and sacrifice. Together, they embodied two sides of resistance, fire and steadfastness, fury and faith. The Demerara rebellion did not bring immediate freedom. Slavery continued for another decade, but the uprising lit a torch that could not be extinguished. By 1833, Britain passed the Abolition of Slavery Act, and historians would forever trace its urgency back to uprisings like Demerara. The empire had been forced to reckon with the truth. The enslaved would never accept their chains in silence. The cane fields of Demerara bore scars that could not be healed, but in those scars lay memory, and in memory, a legacy of resistance. The Demerara uprising ended in blood, but its meaning reached far beyond the plantations. Jack Gladstone and the 9,000 who rose with him proved something eternal, that no whip, no cannon, no empire can suppress the hunger for freedom. For the planters, the rebellion was branded as savagery. For the British government, it was a crisis to be contained. But for those who survived and for history itself, it was a reminder of humanity's most unshakable truth, the right to live as free men and women. Jack's words in the courtroom still echo. We did not rise for blood, we rose for freedom. In that defiance lies the heart of Demerara. His father's calm, unyielding faith adds a second truth, that even when crushed, the spirit of dignity survives. Together, they left behind a legacy larger than victory or defeat. The fire of Demerara did not end in 1823. It burned in every whisper of resistance that followed, in every petition signed in London, in every sermon preached in the Caribbean. It burned in the abolition of slavery itself, achieved a decade later. The rebellion's blood was the ink that forced history to write a new chapter. And yet, the story poses a question that still unsettles. Can we call it rebellion when men and women rise only to claim the lives that were always theirs? If the chains themselves were the crime, then the uprising was not treason, but justice. Today, when we walk the fields of Guyana, the cane still sways in the wind, but beneath the soil lies memory. Jack Gladstone's name, once feared by empire, is remembered as a symbol of courage. The Demerara uprising stands not only as a Caribbean tragedy but as a universal lesson. Freedom may be delayed, drowned in blood, buried beneath empire, but it cannot be denied forever. The fire of Demerara still burns,